Welcome to this edition of Great Books, a lively discussion of a selection from the canon of exceptional literature. Here's your host, Jack Hatfield.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us for the Great Books Show. I'm Jack Hatfield. Our panel meets periodically to discuss great works of classic and modern literature. Les will introduce our selection for today, Carl Jung's essay on life after death. Les?
Carl Gustav Jung, 1875 to 1961, was a Swiss physician and psychoanalyst and was Freud's most prominent follower. His disagreement with Freudian theory that personality formation is rooted in sexuality caused a permanent break between these two eminent men. Jung founded analytical psychology, and his analysis of dream symbolism led him to develop the concept of archetypes and the collective unconscious. This theory provides fundamental insights into the function of dreams and psychic symbols in creativity, as well as a greater appreciation of mystery at the heart of the human existence. His body of work has had major influence on philosophy, literature, anthropology, and religious studies. He was a prolific author and lecturer. The essay we're discussing during this evening is titled On Life After Death. It is Jung's suppositions regarding what happens after death. He freely states that he has no empirical data to support his argument, and states that it consists entirely of memories of images in which I have lived, thoughts, and which have buffeted me. His famous quote applies to this application: "The person who looks outside dreams, the person who looks inside awakes." Because of Jung's long reputation in the areas of conscious and unconscious, this merits this discussion.
I thought it would take off from Les's discussion. He uses several terms here. Maybe we can talk about them. One is conscious reasoning, the unconscious, and then how myth fits in with those two. Does anyone want to take a shot at it?
Well, he thinks critical reason is too constrictive because it cuts off emotional experience. So what he's trying to do is add emotion back into it, and I think he uses the archetype to do that.
Not just emotion. It's
the emotion. Well, it makes it the whole thing. Complete reason, complete the experience. And
right.
He spends the whole time here talking about how he uses rationality to explore the unconscious. After he makes that point about
rationalism is a disease of our time.
yeah.
Right, yes.
That's
Well,
pretty strong.
Critical rationalism.
yeah.
Critical, I think that was logical positivism. He died, when was it? I got that. That was,
Anybody else? How does myth fit in? Go ahead, Joe.
I thought that, I'm not sure that I understood this correctly, but my understanding was that the unconscious, there's the unconscious, the conscious, and myth was a way of, myth essentially was where the two met. Yeah, and it partook of the unconscious and brought material from the unconscious to the consciousness in a way that consciousness could use, and therefore expand its knowledge of itself and of the world, which he seems to think is our purpose for being here, basically, is to grow in that way, to expand our knowledge.
expand awareness.
Expand awareness, yeah.
He gives a definition. Myths are the earliest form of science. When I speak of things after death, I'm speaking out of inner prompting and can go no further than to tell you dreams and myths are related to this subject. So he uses the term mythology as a catch-all for the larger aspect of what it is we're going to discuss. So.
Right, yeah, he's saying the unconscious is not bound by time and space, and that it's just kind of this, I was going to say mess, but it's just this undifferentiated thing, and that to communicate with the consciousness, it has to use myth. It's like poetry. So
that we don't experience our consciousness. He sometimes later on he kind of used the term ego in a negative sense, but our consciousness never really experiences the unconscious in an unmediated way. It's always mediated through dreams and myths.
And myths, the traditional myths.
But being rational, is there anything that can exist without time or space?
Yes.
He posits that there is, and that's
According to him.
Yeah, that's one
Well,
of the questions I had. Where is it kept?
Space and time are
Well, it's not.
relative.
It's
Yeah, but he's saying, well, when you die,
unconscious, not-
what happens to your memory and all of this? What happens to it? So, but he doesn't tell you if it can't exist in the body, where is it going to exist?
Well,
It
that's a
doesn't
good que-
have to.
No, that's a good question. I
is there
thought
a-
that it was ambiguous.
Is there a
because-
super hell out there somewhere that all this stuff goes into?
I had the sense, and this was confusing to me, even after I read it twice, and you guys who know more Jung than I do can shed some light on this maybe. But it was a sense that sometimes he was talking about the unconscious as a part of the mind of an individual.
Yes.
And then at other times he was talking about the unconscious as if it were larger.
It's both.
It's both.
It's both.
well, he has a different term for it.
right.
It's the unconscious, and then he calls it. I'm trying to.
Collective unconscious?
Yeah, the collective unconscious.
that's
is
the
what-
archetype.
He doesn't mention that in
Yeah,
here.
that's the archetype.
No,
the collective.
not necessarily.
Well, but that's when he uses that word archetype. That's what he's referring to as a collective unconscious.
He's saying everybody has these.
Yes, correct.
Has within their unconscious all these archetypes, and one of them he's saying is the trying to find an answer to what happens after we die, and then if we hook in, and he gives two examples. He's talking about sometimes that that he's using that collective unconsciousness to explain how he can have dreams that are outside anything that came in his senses.
Right.
And other times he's talking about better understanding his sensory input through dreams.
One of those archetypes where he says, all life desires eternity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the.
Well,
Everybody has that.
That's a universal
I'm not
one.
sure.
Yeah,
Whether
universal.
animals have a survival instinct, but I don't think they're aware of death. The human species is the only one that is aware of death. Now,
Right.
maybe elephants might have some cognition of death, but
Well,
the
is-
normal animals I don't think do.
Is the archetype that peculiar just to human beings, or is that part of the structure of reality?
I think that's what he's saying. 'Cause
It's human beings.
Human beings.
It's not present in animals.
When he was,
They don't look to the future. They
Yeah.
have no.
Yeah, he didn't mention
cognition.
animals, so.
Yeah.
when this was one of the, I'm glad you mentioned the precognitive stuff, because I also had a question about that. I mean, it was almost as when he was, I think he was a little slippery with this unconsciousness is timeless and spaceless.
little.
because when he did the precognitive stuff, I almost got the sense that he was saying because the unconscious is not bound by time and space, it could go into the future.
Yes.
That's what he was saying.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Well,
And
if there is a future in that dimension.
some
Right, as opposed to just
some
the eternal
scientists
now or something.
are calling a zero sum field. What I'm trying to. Well, whatever. And anyway, is saying that
0 point.
0 point field. Yeah, saying that all of reality to our collective unconscious exists at the same time.
Right.
So, and they also use it to explain some of the new physics that's coming out. But saying that if you touch into that, you can see the future because that's still all right there.
Right.
And
The future
also
is
you
determined.
can
He
understand
says
that
space and
someone
time
doesn't-
are relative, and so you could have this non-temporal dimension where everything's present. In fact, some guys do in physics use that.
One thing, I don't know if we want to spend too much time on it, but I think something you brought up, he does bring up the difference between ego and psyche. And do you know what psyche means?
Closer to soul than ego.
Yeah, right, yeah. And
It may not be soul, but it'd be like soul.
Yeah, that's something I thought he didn't. He's got a separate document on soul that's not included in this, but it's called Man in Search of a Soul, if I remember correctly.
Psyche's soul thing.
Yeah,
So
but,
it's-
but
Close
he
enough.
doesn't go into much detail about the soul itself.
It's because it's, well, very equivalent.
Difficult subject, no question
Yeah,
about
but he
that.
says whatever is going to live after death is going to be in the psyche.
Well,
The ego is a focal point, and it's a very precise focal point. It lifts things into consciousness.
Right.
And that's why he's
Although he seems a little ambivalent about the ego.
One of the things he says regarding this on page 9, he says, for according to the traditional views, the dead are possessors of great knowledge. People have the idea that the dead know far more than we, for Christian doctrine teaches that the hereafter we shall see. However, he goes on to say that those that are dead, if you're communicating with them, their knowledge base stopped the day they died.
Right.
So they need to be in touch with those human beings that are still alive
To understand what's going
in
on.
order to be brought up to speed where it's happening in the society.
That was very much like
To find
Dante.
completion.
Yes.
Like Dante and the Inferno.
Right.
Do you think he really believed life after death? I mean,
I went back and forth with
He
this.
weasels
I think
on that.
He does. But
He says
so
it's a
much,
necessary myth, though.
it's a necessary myth, but he doesn't know whether it corresponds to anything in reality.
Right.
I got the sense that he did.
He says you might as well have the myth.
Yes, right.
Okay?
It's
If
better.
you don't have the myth, he says you're going to go in the dark hole.
yeah,
Well,
something like
that's
that.
Something
all
like
right,
that,
too.
yeah.
But he said only for some people.
Right, because some people would prefer to go into the dark hole,
No,
actually.
I think that you don't have to go into the dark hole.
No,
and
right.
So,
Right.
yeah, so, okay.
Well, he thinks there's some existence afterward, at least, if you believe in infinity, because that's our psyche allows us to touch infinity.
Yeah, right. Our psyche does.
And he talks about that business of the boundlessness and the,
Yes.
and the limitation and
Yes.
how that forces you to confront the question and make the choice.
Yes.
Very existentialist.
So what did you think about the stories, his stories that he's purveying of these experiences he's had and how those stories leads him to these certain conclusions? Did you get anything out of it? Was it one of those stories that jumped out at you about how he arrived at, like the death of his mother? What was going on there, that this precognition that tempted him to believe that his mother was going to die, and then she did, and he drew all these conclusions out of that?
And what's your question?
Yeah.
So what effect did these stories have in here regarding how you think his thought process worked?
He didn't give us the rules.
Right, he
Well, there's
didn't.
no rules. I mean, what he's saying is that gives the
That's
hints.
right. That's his
Well,
view
his
of
hints.
what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, and he says the unconscious, everything they collected, isn't necessarily have anything to do with reality. It can be wrong. in
Correct,
other words.
right.
Well, there are rules, but they're very flexible. He says if there's too much monotony when you're interpreting a dream, then that can't be right. You got to be careful of those kind.
Right.
And he talks about objective and going too far into the subjective. I mean, what those limits are, you don't know.
I'm going to read you something that has to do with kind of what we're talking about. He says, only here in life on earth, where the opposites clash together, can the general level of consciousness be raised. That seems to be man's metaphysical task, which he cannot accomplish without methodology, using myth. Myth is a natural and indispensable intermediate stage between unconscious and conscious cognition. I thought that was kind of summing up much of what we're talking about.
Also makes you wonder whether or not he thinks that if there is an endpoint, whether that would mean that the usefulness of myth was gone. That once the contents of the unconscious had been brought into consciousness through the medium of myth, maybe we no longer need myth.
Need a new myth. You continue to create archetypes because we're in a process of completing awareness, conscious awareness for all of mankind, apparently. Gives us a sense.
for all of
He
us,
talks
right,
about a line of destiny for the conscience, and we've got to add something to all those that, whose development was arrested when they died.
Yeah, he makes that argument because we have become so science-oriented, we're not creating our own myths anymore. And so if that's the case, then the bridge to the unconscious is being lost in the
Well,
process.
myth is devalued because
Right,
it's
yes.
not empirical and,
Right.
scientific, in quotes,
But
rational.
The myth in and of itself is the beauty because it allows you to determine what the myths mean. You don't have someone else telling you what they mean. It's your own process of
Well, that's interesting because I was thinking that he made reference several times to my subjective thing. And I think that what he meant, what I got from that was that he was saying that we can look at this dream the way a Freudian would and see it as not being related to anything outside of myself.
Yes.
And we can look at it in terms of the symbols that are meaningful to me.
Yes.
But that wouldn't be so important as looking at it as an expression of and a conduit toward an unconscious that goes beyond me. Is that?
No,
No?
because I think Jake said something that it's very important that you not have a set
Right.
Be monotonous
prejudice.
interpretation.
You have a
prejudice for
prejudice,
it.
yeah.
You have to relate it to yourself. You have to relate it to that archetype within yourself.
But it's not working out your personal problems necessarily. He wants you to stay away from that. There's a limit. You can go crazy with it, is what he said. Well, I mean, you know how people go too far with it. And he wants you to stay more toward the objective side if you can, I think. I
So
forget
maybe
what
maybe
page
the
it-
idea of the myth and dreams is that they partake of both things. They partake of one's idiosyncratic history.
And you wanna throw that out.
et cetera. And they also partake of, in other words, your own
You want to be very
idiosyncratic
careful
personal
of the
unconsciousness.
idiosyncratic, according to him.
And then they also partake of
Sure. Because
collective unconsciousness.
as long as
something
we
like
have myths
that.
and poetry, we've got myths, guys. I mean, we're never going to not have myths.
Well, to answer your specific question, it says on page 12, myth is a natural,
I knew it was in there
indispensable
somewhere.
intermediate stage between unconscious and conscious cognition. True, the unconscious knows more than the conscious does, but its knowledge is of a special sort. Knowledge in eternity, usually without reference to the here and now, not couched in language of the intellect.
Knowledge in eternity. Interesting phrase.
See, one thing he and I think understand this, archetypes, one thing he kind of started on this is he looked at different myths across the country, the world.
Right.
And found, like an old crone was a myth that throughout the transition from especially what he did was boys to men, that was an archetype. So that is common. That is a little different than our being able to get to the collective unconscious and realizing something in the future that's happening now.
Okay.
So it's kind of both.
Okay.
Yeah. So. And by the way, one other thing is, what you said, he has a term I think it's called actualization, is saying that our goal in life, in psychology, is to bring things out of our unconscious to our consciousness. And that's what this whole thing is trying to do.
Yeah, there was a very good portion in here on the goals about the Oriental and the Eastern mind and the Western mind.
And the Western mind.
And so the Western mind is goal-oriented, and the Eastern mind is more live in the moment.
Yeah.
And so,
Okay.
and that's how he got hooked up with Joseph Campbell, because of this idea of
Self-improvement.
mythology. Right, yes.
Extroverted and introverted.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
One of the things he also says here, we talked briefly about the soul, he says that although there is no way to marshal valid proof of continuance of the soul after death, there are nevertheless experiences which make us thoughtful. I take them as hints and do not presume to ascribe to them the significance of insights. So he's not denying it, but he's not affirming it either. He's telling you it's an insight.
He doesn't have enough effort. It's
Right,
not an
right. It's
insight.
not-
It's a hint, not
It's
an
a hint,
insight,
right.
because
It's
he
a
doesn't
hint,
have
right,
enough
exactly.
documentation.
And he says, in general, the conception people form of the hereafter is largely made up of wishful thinking and prejudices. So he's
So
very,
he doesn't throw out critical rationalism, but
Right.
he's done
Well,
what
when you
is-
put rationalism aside, then
can't-
how do you come up with documentation?
Well, you can't put it aside. He's not
Well,
putting
he
it
puts
aside.
No, he doesn't.
doesn't he?
No, he's
Now,
extrapolating.
Rationalism is a process of the conscious mind.
Okay.
but he's saying you can use the source
Correct.
of the unconscious
Right.
and then bring rationalism into it.
Rationalism,
Try to
yeah.
figure
If you
it out.
start with critical rationalism, you'll smother.
Right.
You'll
Yes.
smother everything that
Right.
that'll come out. So you'll never-
You're limiting yourself.
But you can study myths like
Interesting.
crazy.
Yeah, if you're rational, you're limiting.
You're
Listen
limiting
to that.
So that,
No, if you're a critical rationalist, there's a difference. I think he's talking about logical positivism because they're so nutty. I mean, they were. They're
at
not
that time.
anymore.
Yeah.
so that rests the question, what is sanity then? Are you rational and sane, or are you unconscious and insane or
Both.
sane? So those are other issues that he didn't go into here.
He talked about split personality,
Yes,
so
he did, yes. And there was, in his biographical history, that split personality is a product of his upbringing, because his mother had these episodes
Yeah,
back
it's
and
not,
forth.
it's not in here.
Yeah, but
No.
What
this is how
else-
this ends up.
we've talked about a lot.
What
much
else is
it.
in here that grabbed you?
I like that section he did very well on East and West mindset. on how things are done. That's on page 17, I think, or 16 or 17. But I thought he really had some good insights on the difference between the East and the West and the thought process and how we look at life.
Yeah, he mentions reincarnation.
Right, yes,
All right.
that was right. It's,
Did he believe in it?
I don't know that he says he does or he doesn't. He's just looking at it as a
But
phenomenon.
reincarnation is an archetype, right?
Correct. Well,
But it's not a
is it
universal archetype, because we don't believe it in the West.
Well,
and
is
it
it,
does.
and is it a
Kind of do now in the West is instead of going to another life, which is strictly a reincarnation, you go to heaven and you live there. So it's pretty much the same to me. But
It's based on your karma, isn't it?
Yes.
Maybe.
well, it's just like whether you go to heaven in Christianity is based on your karma, whether you're a good guy or not, or you say 5 words just before you die, even though you don't
okay.
believe it. So,
Sure.
Boy,
yeah,
that depends how orthodox you are, Jack.
I know.
he
You know, I like
he
that.
seemed to make a distinction between the notion of reincarnation as endless and an infinite cycle without any goal. And then he says that with Buddha,
Right.
Yeah.
You might come back.
yeah, there's an introduction of the idea of a goal or an end state or something like
Yeah.
that. Is that, you say that's
Yes, I saw that too.
yeah, but a lot of people don't believe that. They're
What-
Buddhists. I mean, most of them do. I'd say 3/4 do it.
Buddhists have a goal, is what
Not
he
all,
said.
but a different kind
Well,
of.
he
so.
said that, I mean,
Yeah, right, yeah,
I'm
right.
not disagreeing
Yes,
with you.
Yeah, this is on page 16. This is where he addresses this. He said, the Western man, the meaninglessness of a merely static universe is unbearable. He must assume that it has meaning. The Oriental does not need to make this assumption. Rather, he himself embodies it. Whereas the Occidental feels the need to complete the meaning of the world, the Oriental strives for the fulfillment of meaning in man, stripping the world and existence from himself. The
What does
Buddha.
that mean
The Buddha.
in your words?
Oh, it means that we are goal-oriented and we are not satisfied unless we have some goal that I mean, in the Christian theology, it's heaven, that's the goal. Whereas in Oriental philosophy, it's not necessarily going to a certain place.
Well, we strive for completeness by addition in the Western, and by subtraction in the Eastern.
Right.
And then you can put them together, according to him, for that reason.
Western man seems predominantly
Extrovert.
extroverted, Eastern man predominantly introverted. The former projects the meaning and considers that it exists in objects. The latter feels the meaning in himself, but the meaning is both without and within. So he's blended the two together.
So does this make sense? I mean, is this something we're kind of at the end, and you can say that his whole thing about the unconscious and myth and rationalization is all that? Does that fit with what you believe, or is it just completely wrong?
I think what he's provided here is a framework for a method of thought.
Do you
To
believe?
look at this. He's not going to give you an answer. I think he's telling you this is one of many methods to look at the prospect.
No, he's giving an answer. He's saying look at myth. That we can
Yes.
use that for a lot of hints for
Right.
our rational mind to take off.
But
So
it's in the Western theology where the answer is there. Here he's telling you there's another way to do it. Yeah, I mean, in the Christian theology, they say you have a soul and you're going to heaven.
Does he answer the question, is there life after death?
No.
He doesn't. He doesn't.
answer.
No, that's the point. He's giving
I
you.
was
a-
looking for the answer.
No.
He's giving you a tool on how to make an analysis different from what you're normally brought up to think or believe in. That's all he's doing.
Well, he says we have to, one of the questions we have to deal with, whether we want to or not, is the here and the hereafter.
Right.
How are we related to it? And then we can decide whether we touch the infinite or not, and we have to decide whether we need a myth to deal with our non-existence, or we don't need a myth. And we all have myths.
I
That's
thought
all
he
theology
recommended
is.
a myth.
He did.
Yeah.
He feels you be whole if you have a myth. That completes you.
I had,
Different
to get specifically to your question, I had a hard time with this idea of the unconsciousness being timeless in such a way as to allow him to make sense of precognitive dreams as touching an
sure.
unconsciousness
Right, yes.
that spans time and space. I had a hard time with that, and because I found that to be non-persuasive, at least in this,
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
because I felt it to be non-persuasive. That really removes the foundation from a lot of what he was saying. Plus, I have a little bit of a prejudice for reasons of my own. That dreams and mythological productions, there must be something like a collective unconscious, but largely they're a lot more understandable. He kept pushing this aside as expressions of the idiosyncratic unconsciousness, unconscious of the person, that they are productions of the person and they're expressive of the person, what he would call the subjective interpretation. And
Well, he doesn't tell you about the myths he studied in here, but
on the
there are.
other hand, I mean, his dreams are what they were, and and I hear stuff like that in my work, and you gotta wonder what is that? I'm not sure I would put it in the framework of there's this thing called an unconscious that somehow is like a gas kind of that permeates everything, that past, future, etc.
He doesn't, the stuff I've read, he doesn't bring out the collective unconscious. Most of it has to, and part of it is the way I read it, most of it has to do with the subjective unconsciousness. And using
of the individual.
Well, the question is, are there really archetypes?
Well,
I mean, his whole philosophy hinges on that, is uniting the rational and the emotional. And puts us into,
One of the things I felt that summed this up, he says, a belief proves to me only the phenomenon of the belief,
I was about to
not
quote
the
you that.
content of the belief.
yeah, he's very rational and empiricist at the bottom.
At times, yeah. The other thing I thought about this was just how ineradicable is the Gnostic impulse. And he refers
He says so, too.
He refers to Gnostic. The idea that somehow there's the spark of something in us that connects with something much larger, and our goal and what we need to do is to become aware of that, have that knowledge, and then we can rejoin that thing in the pleroma or whatever the heck it was.
There is an
that
open-endedness.
thing never goes away. It
No.
just keeps coming back.
So
and
in
back
Genesis,
and
there's
back.
two trees, the trees of immortality and the tree of good and evil.
I didn't hear
knowledge.
him quote
Look which
those.
one they took.
1 minute. Well, I like his quote at the end. This is a confession of faith to me more than anything, but as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. And in a sense that's true. I mean, that's very poetic.
That's interesting.
But that's what keeps me going. He talked about understanding and all that too. The drive to understanding drove him. Well, that's the only reason I'm in great books, because I'm not going to do anything anymore but die in about 10 years. But I still want to learn.
My grandfather said, live and learn, die and forget it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you forget it even before you die.
He has a different relationship.
You know what his definition of religion was, don't you?
I have no idea.
Insurance in this life against fire in the next.
Well, that was what's his face? He was just a skull, wasn't it?
Against fire.
Yeah, he was just an old country boy. Yeah.
That was Pascal or somebody said that.